And you don't want a constantly polarized relationship. You don't want to be constantly polarized. It's exhausting. It's a lot of energy. There's a lot of heat. There's a lot of fire. There's a lot of passion, but there's not as much connection or resonance if you're constantly in polarity. It's more that you want to know how to do it so that you can have that fire and passion and also have connection.
All right, everyone, welcome to Claimed. I have a super special guest with me today. Her name is Melanie Curtin, and she's an international speaker, a sex researcher, which is super exciting, with a master's degree from Stanford. She's a creator of Please Her in Bed, which is the world's first research-based course on how to please women sexually and how to talk about sex in an open way. I also know that she works with men, and you can tell us more about this, Melanie, in a second. And you also run a really popular podcast, Dear Men, How to Rock Sex, Dating, and Relationships. Welcome, Melanie. Super excited to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Do you want to add anything to your amazing bio? You quote me at Stanford degree and a sex researcher, but do you want to tell us more about like what is your work about today and what is your focus on?
Yeah, so a big part of my background is I lived on the East Coast for a long time, and I was involved in a nonprofit to stop sexual abuse in the Jewish community. And so I was focused on sort of pathological side of sexuality. And one of the things I quickly determined was that if we don't establish a healthy, open sexual culture, we will end up with abuse. And I sort of switched sides to then be talking and speaking and researching healthy sexuality and what keeps us from that in order to establish that safe and healthy sexual culture. So I think that's a little bit of a unique background that I have. And I would say it is something I'm quite mindful of in my own work. I'm sure something that comes up for you in your work as well, of just how prevalent that kind of sexual trauma is, and then how that plays out later in life. And that can affect people in different ways, sometimes sexually, sometimes relationally, definitely in dating. And sometimes it can be a little bit hidden, right? Like we don't lead with it. Maybe we've never told anyone, or we've only told a few people, or it hasn't gone well. And it can inform a lot of our sexuality. So I'm a big advocate for survivors of sexual abuse, and that informs part of my work with men.
Mm-hmm. So I have a couple of questions here because you threw in some pretty serious terms like sexual abuse and healthy, safe sex culture, and I want to definitely dive into that. But just so that we understand, what is your work currently sent? So you do work with men in what capacity?
Yeah, so I currently coach men and couples, primarily men, and then the work I'm doing with couples is starting to expand. And I work with both single men and men that are in relationships, including married, a lot of married men actually, that want to generate more polarity in their relationships. They want to improve their marriages. They want to become bigger versions of themselves. They want to take more power back in their lives. And for the single men, sometimes it's, I've repeated some unhealthy patterns. I'm aware of that. I want to do this better. I want to date better. I want to relate better. I want to grow. I haven't had a lot of success with women in the past. I really want that to change. Something's got to change. I can't keep doing what I've been doing anymore.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And so I'm curious, and in what capacity, Melanie, do you work with them? Do you work with them as a therapist, as a coach? And what are the tools that you use to help them? And I love that you mentioned polarity, because I'm like, ooh, there's sex involved here and polarity. And how does that interplay, especially in a marriage?
Yeah. I am a coach. I work with men through coaching. And then depending on what's happening in their lives, sometimes I will refer them to someone like a somatic coach or a somatic therapist, depending on level of trauma and things like that. And polarity is a big part of the conversations that we're having. And our program is, I would say, unique in that I co-run it with my co-coach Jason Lang. So we run our program, it's a group program, and we run it together so that men get a transmission of the masculine and the feminine on our calls, and they have the community of men around them. Because what I have seen repeatedly over and over and over is that men are isolated. They're isolated and they're lonely. And lonely men are often not in their power. They're not able to lead. They're not able to generate polarity with women. They are anxious a lot of the time, depression, anxiety. A lot of that comes from loneliness and isolation. And I think in our culture, a lot of people are lonely. A lot of human beings are lonely. And I think that for men, it's exacerbated. It is worse for men generally than women. And I think that the social science research is pretty clear that right around the age of 12, boys stop sort of expressing affection to each other. They stop giving as many hugs, holding hands. In our culture, I'm talking about mostly in the Western culture. And that comes at a really high cost, that they start to become isolated from one another. And there's a lot of homophobia in the culture to the extent that they don't connect with one another and they don't feel like they can be open with one another. And so they're all in these isolated bubbles. They're not really able to actually share what's going on for them on a really deep level. And that leads to loneliness and isolation, which then has them less willing to take risks. For example, pursue women, go after sex, even within a relationship, right? Initiating sex with their wife, them holding a lot of shame around that and not being able to talk about it with anyone, to actually share, this is what's up for me in my relationship, I think is a huge problem, and one that we kind of rectify in our program, but that's a wider cultural problem that I think it's good for women to understand and to grasp how lonely and isolated many, many men are.
Mm. Yeah, well, I love that you bring up that subject because, my work is all centered around helping women basically reframe their belief systems about men. And some of the biggest key takeaways from the work that I do with women that women report back is understanding the male journey and really creating a lot of empathy for the male journey and lead with curiosity. And I want to ask you this question about polarity because you are a sex researcher. And when I hear, you know, for example, when we talk about polarity, so this is actually my question to you because, polarity in general, feminine, masculine polarity can be a term, is a term that's basically just labels, right? And it can be an esoteric term. It can be very woohoo. It can be very down to earth, but it's not, this is not science. This is like, we can find elements of this in different religions and nature and whatever, this is like a concept and that we, as coaches, we take it and make it our own and stuff like that. So, I'm actually curious, how do you, Melanie, define polarity in
Oh,
relationship?
that's a great question. Polarity in relationship.
Well, in
Yeah.
polarity in general, but I guess since we talk about relationships and men and women, I'm curious, how do you then define that in a relationship?
Yeah. For me, polarity is the dance between two sides of the same coin. So I sort of often will use the words alpha and omega instead of masculine and feminine because masculine and feminine have a lot of cultural baggage. So
Mm-hmm.
alpha energy, directive, penetrative. I'm going after what I want. I'm going in a direction. Clarity, light, the sun, and then omega energy, mystery, darkness. I'm in the flow of what's happening. Receptivity, earth, moon, and we all, as you I'm sure teach your women, have both elements within us, both alpha and omega. And a lot of us are out of balance. A lot of us have overdeveloped one to the detriment of the other. And so the way we talk about polarity with our men is when you are holding alpha, when you are in that role, then you polarize your partner and they get to hold omega. They get to play in omega and vice versa. And you don't want a constantly polarized relationship. You don't want to be constantly polarized. It's exhausting. It's a lot of energy. There's a lot of heat. There's a lot of fire. There's a lot of passion. but there's not as much connection or resonance if you're constantly in polarity. It's more that you want to know how to do it so that you can have that fire and passion and also have connection. So, for example, a lot of the men that we work with, when they come to us, they're pretty passive. They're pretty passive when it comes to women. Let's say they're holding back a lot. They're holding back all the time. They don't want to offend a woman. They don't want her to feel unsafe, and so they don't go after it. They don't go after it. They're holding back. They're leaning back. They're kind of like holding this role. And the whole idea of being able to access that power and that energy and your alpha energy is that when you say, I want to take you out for coffee, how do you feel about that? That's going to generate a certain response versus like, hey, so what are you doing, later?
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's
Mm-hmm.
there it's an energy. It's maybe I have the same intention, I would like to date you, but in one I'm holding alpha energy. I'm holding that directionality versus the receptivity. And what we see is that as we are working with these men and as they're stepping into their power more, they're having a lot more success with a lot less confusion, right? It's really confusing when there aren't sort of these clear energies that we're able to bring. If we're not able to bring both, a lot of times what I have seen is fogginess, cloudiness, confusion, frustration. It just doesn't feel as good versus directionality. So, for example, I was talking to one of my men who was married, is no longer married. And he was reflecting on his marriage now, understanding about polarity. I was asking him about their sex life, and he said, well, yeah, when I drove date night, we had sex a lot of the time because I was leading. But he said, in many cases, I wasn't leading. I kind of abdicated responsibility, or I abdicated leadership in the relationship, partly because I didn't know about this stuff. I didn't know that these things were connected. I didn't understand that when I drove and said, I'm taking us here, or I bought us tickets for this, or I want to have this experience with you. How do you feel about that? And then I'm attuning to your energy. I didn't grasp that that was part of how I built a healthy relationship. I didn't know what to do. And I think that's something that I've heard from a lot of my men is, wow, I wish I had learned this sooner. Right? They come to us
That's
and they
exactly
learn this
what
and
I
they're like,
hear from my women. You know what, Melanie? We should take all of your men and we should take all of my women and we should like bring them together on date nights so they can like, I mean the
yes,
single ones, obviously, and they can like, here's a masculine man who's working on himself and here's a feminine woman who's like, looking for
yes.
a partner.
We should.
Yeah,
We should do
so
a party or something, a
I
virtual
think so.
party.
We should. Yeah,
Yeah.
we should do like speed dating or something. Here, come and meet conscious masculine men. Um,
Yes.
so I want to ask you about something. So I loved how you explained polarity, but you said something really interesting that I want to unpack a little bit more, that being in polarity constantly is exhausting and we can't always be polarized. Can you just unpack that a little bit more? Like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So it's a little bit like in nature, you know, you would never have the sun all the time, right? Even in very northern atmospheres, even when you have the sun 24 hours in a certain day, that's a season of the year. There are natural cycles in nature. There's no part of nature that's constantly growing except cancer. That's the only part of nature with constantly growing cells. There's always a dance that's happening. You're going in and out. If you have intense polarity with someone, there's a lot of heat. There's going to be a lot of excitement and passion and um, in my experience, frequently trauma bonding. Right? There's not necessarily a deep sense of safety and resonance because one of my clients put it really well. He said, "Polarity heats the bodies, and resonance bonds the hearts." So if when
Mm-hmm.
you're in resonance with someone, not polarity, in resonance, you're empathizing with them, you're deeply listening to them, you're attuning to them, you're with them in a way that feels, what's the word?
Like
That feels
connection.
attuned.
Mm-hmm.
Connection. Yeah, connection, depth, intimacy. Intimacy, real intimacy is not just polarity. It doesn't exist. You have to have the part where you're both feeling the same thing, right? You're getting along, you're doing something together. For example, you're cooperating on something. If you're constantly in the heat part of it, you're going to burn up. There's no way that you can sustain that forever. You can weave it in. I think the healthiest relationships weave it in and out like a dance, but you're not constantly in polarity, or you would never be able to get anything done. You would never get anything done. You would just be having sex all the time. That's all you would do. You can't live life that way. You should
Yeah,
just do that.
it's really interesting. So you're saying that resonance is opposite of polarity, or they're
I don't
different
know if I would
things?
say I don't know if I'd say opposite, but um, maybe complementary in the way that the
Mm-hmm.
sun isn't the opposite of the moon and the moon isn't the opposite of the sun. The moon is actually a
Mm-hmm.
reflection of the sun, but it's a different energetic, and they complement each other. I mean, how I'm curious, how do you teach about resonance?
Well, that's what I'm trying to get to. I'm just trying to understand this concept because it's really interesting, and I mean, all of us teach it differently through our own lens. Let me just, I'll tell you how I teach it, and how, because I think we're doing the same thing, but maybe we just label it differently. But let me just try and understand it until the end. So, can I be in polarity in a relationship? Let's say, can I be in my feminine, my man being in his masculine, while still having resonance, while still having that heart to heart? Like, what I'm talking about is, can I be in my feminine, fully surrendered, fully here, letting go of control, while my man, is holding space for me, direction, penetration, and we can have that resonance heart to heart while maintaining our poles in a relationship.
I think you can have that, yes. And if that's the only dance you're able to do, it's going to be hard to have a healthy relationship. And what I mean by that is that sometimes the moment is going to call for the opposite. Sometimes your man is going to need to be in omega. For example, if he loses a parent or a loved one,
Hmm.
he's going to need support from his partner. And if you aren't able to be that, right, be fluid in it and provide that, it's going to be problematic. So what we've seen in I would argue in the past is more rigid roles where there wasn't that fluidity. People weren't able to move with what the moment called for, and sometimes the moment calls for resonance. This is a moment I need to provide this for my partner versus that. Did
So when
that
you talk
answer the
about,
question?
yeah, so but what you're talking about is switching polarity roles, right? So for example, when your man is, when you say, I think what you meant, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you meant is when you can't be always in polarity all the time, 100% of the time. What you meant by that is, like, as a woman, you can't be in your feminine 100% of the time in the relationship or in your omega. And as a man, your man can't be 100% of the time in his masculine because, yeah, that's not sustainable, because sometimes he needs to let go of control, whether he's sick, whether his mother dies, whether he just, has a really shit day and he just wants, so to me, when that happens, we just switch polarity. It's like reverse polarity. Um, so I'm trying. Do you know what I mean? So for me, it's not necessarily. So for me, resonance is like almost, yeah, complementary to polarity, but it's almost like vulnerability that happens, that has to happen, that has to be in a relationship to be healthy. I agree with you. But then in the way how you explain it, how I see it, it's just, well, we just switch roles and it happens from time to time. But most of the time, if we maintain that, let's call it natural polarity, that as a woman, as a feminine essence woman, I am in my feminine or omega, and as a masculine essence man, you are in your alpha. We are polarized, we're attracted to each other. We choose to play these roles that make us happy and fulfilled and creates that sexual attention. But of course, we then switch when it's called for, but it's probably less of the time. So maybe like an 80-20, 70-30, every couple finds their own way around it.
Yeah, I think the image that's coming to mind, I'm sure you're like this too intuitively. The image that's coming to mind is, for example, there's a couple and they're in the kitchen and a song comes on that they both like and they're singing together. the way that two friends would sing together. So there's not polarity in that moment. No one's holding one of the roles. They're together, they're doing something together, enjoying each other. They're both in omega. In that moment, they're not polarized. They're both flowing with that moment, which is omega. Or they're sitting down, they're going through their finances, and they are both in alpha. That is not a polarized moment. They are thinking, they are rationalizing, they are planning, they are future pacing, they are doing alpha together as a team. So they're not polarized in that moment. And that's kind of what I was getting at of there are times in a healthy relationship when both of you are going to be in omega or both of you are going to be in alpha, because we live in the real world where we have to be able to do things. And if you're only in that polarized space, sometimes you can get things done for sure. And a lot of times other things are happening, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's one person holding space for the other who's emoting or you're having sex. But we live in the real world where there are other things that need to happen in order for you to have a healthy relationship. Did that help?
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And so I'm just, because I'm thinking about my clients and for myself as well. It's really, as I said, it's fascinating how people teach polarity and how they think about it. And so what you're saying is, yeah, so there's that couple, in a couple, you definitely polarity is extremely important and you play it. But then there are moments there where it's depolarized, let's say, and that's also healthy because you can't always be in that feminine, masculine, alpha, omega state. And that's what I think is really confusing to people in general, men and women. It's like, okay, so Melanie, how do we know? So how do we distinguish? Because a lot of my clients ask me, well, you know, it's so funny. Women come into my program, they work with me, and they want to dissect every single situation, every minute of their life, and every screenshot of their dating life, and understand is that masculine or is that feminine? Simply because these are labels or omega or alpha or whatever. It's like they really want to understand, like, okay, how do I? Because these are concepts, right? This is not science. And so I'm curious, how do you think about that? Like, how would you define a healthy relationship where polarity exists? But and so within that polarity, we can also change roles, like do the reversal, right? But also when polarity, well, when we are depolarized, like especially in my case, I am my husband is also my business partner, and so I've been actually struggling with this concept for a long time in terms of like, okay, well, how do I bring polarity into our business, into the business, right? Because can we both be leaders, can we not? And so I think that in my marriage, the very clear example, or even parenting, right? Like, for example, when we're business partners, I can clearly see that we are partners, and there's no like, you lead, I surrender and let go. I mean, sometimes I have to do that, but also he has to do that. So it's like equal, right? In parenting, I can see another example where we can both play that role. Or when you talk about the finances, right? Or something. So when we both have to engage our heads at the same time, it's that. But and when we have to engage our hearts and feeling, like you're saying, maybe when we're dancing, although in dance, if you dance Latin American dance, that's a lot of polarity there. So you see there's so many confused, like, so how do you distinguish between these two, and how do you know, let's say, like if a man comes to you and asks you, so in which situations do I know when to take that alpha role, when to take the omega role, or when to not take any role and be depolarized?
That's a great question. I think so. Our program focuses a lot on presence. It's called Pillars of Presence. That's our program for men. And a lot of what we teach is how to be present in your body. And the whole point of that is to follow the instincts of your body. And so
Mm.
I'm going to give you an example. For example, I was talking to a client about a moment where he was dating this woman and something happened something happened to an article of her clothing, and she felt like he missed it, um, and she was like exposed in this certain way. I'm not going to disclose the details, but she was angry. She was pissed at him. She was like, "You should have noticed this. You're responsible for telling me things like this. You know, it's your fault." And I think that's a good example of kind of alpha meeting alpha, right? Of like, I'm telling you this thing and I'm telling you in this tone, and this is what I mean by it, versus, "Oh, I'm feeling really dropped. I feel really dropped. And I'm feeling a little scared and unsafe right now." And then stopping and seeing the response, right? The ability to be to be in omega and to flow in that way, I think isn't necessarily taught in a lot of families of origin. And so there are a lot of women who only know how to explain or tell or criticize in this way that kind of knocks two alpha, beings together. And in my experience with men, their instinct in that moment is to fight. Their instinct is to meet the criticism with a rebuttal. "Well, no, I was doing this, or I meant that," or there's an instinct to kind of meet that moment in that way, versus the softer response. And I don't mean weaker. I think a lot of people hear the word softer and think weaker, but it's not weak. It's very brave in actuality to soften and get to the vulnerability and share, "I felt this way. I felt dropped. I
You
felt
mean him
sad."
saying, I feel dropped, or
No,
her
her
saying?
saying that. Her saying that. Because
Right.
what she was saying was, "You didn't notice this thing, and I felt," she didn't even say, "I felt exposed." She was basically like, "You did it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You
So
did it
what's the,
wrong. You should have noticed."
yeah,
Instead
what is
of,
his reaction? So we can't change what she's doing, right? So when you're coaching men, how do you coach men on how does he approach this situation?
so one of the ways, it's a little complicated, but I'm going to simplify it in this way. I think it can be a very generous act on the part of the man in that scenario to not meet that with like, "No,
Mm-hmm.
what I meant was this," or "I don't understand," but to say, "Can you tell me a little bit more about how it felt?" So eliciting more of that vulnerability and softening, I think that's a huge opportunity for a man to invite more of that out and actually get to the vulnerability underneath. Because most of us, when we're complaining or we're criticizing, there's a need or a desire underneath that. There's the soft underbelly of whatever it is that we're saying, and we're saying it like this, and we're sort of trained to do this and say it like this and prove our point, the same way that we would with a work email, for example. And so in that moment, I think that holding alpha is actually the conscious responsive version of alpha, is expanding and holding it and saying, "Tell me more about how that felt. What happened for you just now?" And inviting that deeper level. That's advanced practice, though. That's most people, that's advanced. Most people aren't going to start there. But that's why, in my experience, it's working best when both partners are trying. They're both trying. She's trying. If she's playing omega, she's trying to soften. She's trying to get to the essence. She's willing to open her heart and make herself vulnerable and reveal that. She's able to do that at least some of the time. And he's able to hold that space and elicit her truth from her as she's sharing. There's a generosity to that, and there's an expansiveness versus, "I'm collapsed. I did it wrong. I'm never going to be good enough. I can't do this." That collapsed sort of place that some people can get into, which is also not helpful in that moment. And of course, no one's going to get it perfect. But I think that's the whole point, is that as we expand in our nervous systems and we get more present in our bodies, we tend to become more capable of these more advanced ways of being. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not just about thinking about it or proving it or learning more stuff. It's about practices in the body, right? A lot of what we're working with in our men are breath practices, strength practices, possibly medicine journeys, working with other men in a somatic way, that it has to be done through the body mind. It can't just be done through the head, because that's not where particularly polarity, lives. It lives in the body, not in the mind.
Hmm. So tell me more about the body. Why in the body? And why somatic therapy? When you recommend, because you probably don't know much about my work, but I actually the foundational pillar of my work is feminine embodiment. So I think what you're doing with your men is actually masculine embodiment, and that's how you are supporting the men in their polarity journey, right? In their relationships, in their lives, and so it's really interesting. I didn't even know you do embodiment practices, but now I do. And so I'm curious about, and for the women listening, they know, like I talk about embodiment all the time, why it lives in the body and why it's so important for a woman to drop out of her head. So I'm going to tell you what I teach my women, and then I'd love to hear whether it's similar, opposite, and then we can just like kind of chat about all that. So what I teach women and my whole message and is all about, you know, and I work with women who are successful and who are very much, a go, 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 um, you know, career oriented, do, hustle, lean in, and all these messages that, unfortunately, the new feminism wave has just ingrained in us. Well, some of it is good, but a lot of it hasn't been good. So it just, there are two sides to that. But essentially, what happens is, we need, what I teach is that we need to get out of our heads and into our own bodies. Like when women wonder about, or when they talk about this polarity stuff and they start googling and going on Instagram and YouTube videos, and like they all want to be more feminine, right? Like, and they find these articles and tips about like dress a certain way and like burn candles and have your curly hair, put on makeup and fashionable. And look, I teach all of that too, and I love that. But my whole thing is that that's not enough. You can burn candles all day long and wear makeup and fashion and everything, but that's not going to change the fact that you don't feel good enough deep inside. And you actually, we can talk about all day about feminine and what it is, and that's the women that are attracted to my work. They know there's a lot more depth here. And with embodiment practices that I teach in my program, it's helping them actually feel like discover their own feminine flavor in terms of like, how does it feel when I'm in my feminine or when I'm in my omega, right? Because it's also different for every woman. And so you have to explore, do the work and really allow yourself to express that. So getting out of your head and into your body and into your heart and into your womb space or your hips and doing a lot of movement. So I teach this fundamental practice called, feminine flow that allows you to just, out of your head, especially when we talk about dating and men, right? Because what happens is, that example of you, well, you didn't notice that and you're wrong and da, 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 to me that would be a woman who's very much in her head and very much bringing that go, go, go and tell people what to do, bringing that in her dynamic with a man. That really doesn't work, because what that elicits in most men who aren't doing this work, it's like, no, I didn't tell. So this is when we had that bump, right, of head. So that's how I explain. And there's obviously, so we started this conversation actually with sexual abuse and sexual trauma, and you mentioned somatic therapy, because feminine embodiment is stems from somatic therapy, or at least has the same principles. And so it all has connected with, and I, some of the teachers that I read and follow are like Bessel van der Kolk and, Peter Levine and all of that the body stores trauma and the body stores frozen tension, stuff like that. So that's why the work that I do with it is all in embodiment, because that's where the practice is. So I'm curious on the reverse side. I think this is going to be really interesting for women to hear from you in terms of how do you approach embodiment and why it's important for men, because you said it's not in the head, it's in the body. So I'm just curious why, and what practices do you bring to that? And I'm curious, what do you think about what I just shared as well?
Oh, I love everything you just shared. I'm thrilled to hear that. And I think there's a lot of parallels, because we are also working with men on dropping into their bodies and out of their heads. And so, for example, on a date, a man who's in his head is like, Is it working? Does she like me? Have I name dropped enough? Should I tell her about this thing? What if she doesn't think that I'm good enough? I should talk about this other thing. And so he's all caught up in his head, and he's not noticing her. He's not noticing her. He's not maybe putting attention on her, and he's certainly not connected to his turn on. So part of what turns on the feminine is the masculine being present in his body, putting attention on her, and feeling his own turn on. Him feeling his desire for her is often what turns her on. So for our men, a lot of our men get a lot of first dates and not a lot of second dates, right? They're
This is
going on
exactly what
dates.
my women are struggling with too. It's like he called me for a first date, but he never called me back, like ghosting or whatever. So I'm really surprised to hear that women are experiencing that. So what are they saying? Like she's also not replying, or she's saying no, she doesn't want to see them again?
Yeah, ghosting, a lot of ghosting,
Wow.
or friend zone, right? Oh,
Uh-huh.
it was really nice to meet you. We had a great conversation. I'm just not feeling it.
Yeah.
Because again, if he's up in his head and he hasn't dropped down into his body, he's not going to be able to generate that polarity. He's not going to be able to feel his own, be with his own turn on, feel his own turn on in her presence, put attention on her, have her feel desired. She has to feel desired. Many women have to feel desired in order to feel sexy. When they feel desired and they feel sexy, man, they want to see that guy again. But if it's just like all resonance, right? And maybe I'm using that word improperly in this context, but when it's just like, oh, we got along great. We talked about this. We talked about work. We had a great conversation. We connected on a certain level, but I didn't feel desired. I could be friends with
Or
him,
she says,
but I'm not
I'm
going to
not
go on another
attracted.
date.
Yeah, or she says, I'm not attracted to him. So great conversation, intellectually stimulating, blah, blah, and I'm not attracted to him. And then I ask her immediately when a woman says, I'm not attracted, I'm like, why? And she's like, I'm just not. I'm like, no, there's always a reason why you're not attracted. Why? And when we dig down into that, she says, well, there's like literally physical characteristics that she's not attracted to, like he might be a little bit chubby, or there's like something else, like some woman said, oh my god, like his breath smelled really bad and I was in the car with him, and like stuff like that, which I'm sure men talk about as well. But these are kind of on the surface, but a lot of the times it was, I'm not attracted to him because he's not well, they literally said he's not in his masculine, like he doesn't evoke that. I think this is what you're talking about. It's there, like great conversation, but where is that attraction? Where's him being here, being with me, being connected to himself? Those pheromones flying around. Yeah, it's really interesting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where's his fire? Where's his
Yeah.
fire? We talk about that a lot of men feel deeply ashamed of their sexual drive. They have witnessed their fathers or other people being violent with their sexual drive. And I don't just mean rape violence, but just maybe they cheated, or they were raised by a mom who was like, don't be like your father. They were raised around women who were shaming of men's sexuality, sometimes for good reason. But so they are not even aware of it, but they've repressed that part of themselves for years, sometimes for decades, out of a noble desire to have her feel safe. My men, the men that I work with, have two major fears. One, being creepy. They're terrified of coming across as creepy. And two, having a woman feel unsafe with them. They are terrified of having a woman feel unsafe. So it's coming from a good place. It's almost like there's a way they've neutered themselves because they don't want to take advantage of a woman. They don't want to be so thirsty that they make her feel unsafe. And so they've cut it off completely. So
And
they're
in that
in
way,
their,
they self-sabotage themselves because they don't get into that masculine, and they make themselves unattractive. Yeah.
Precisely. So a lot of the work that we're doing with men is helping them reclaim that part. There's nothing wrong with your sex drive. There's nothing wrong with your sex drive. There's nothing wrong with desire. In fact, we want that from you. We do. We want that part from you. We just don't want men who don't take no for an answer. That's the truth. I don't mind if a man approaches me, but if I decline, I want him to go away. And I'm sure you have your own stories. A lot of women, that guy, a lot of my guys are afraid of being that guy. That guy isn't a guy who approaches. It's a guy who approaches and then doesn't take no for an answer. That's what feels dangerous. That's what feels unsafe. It's not just a man's desire.
Well,
It's that
let's
desire without temperance.
let's pause there, because I think that, and I've had these conversations with men on this podcast about no is no, which is not always the case in my experience, and with working with clients. So for example, when you give that example of when he approaches and I say no, that actually doesn't always mean no. That means sometimes that can mean you're not approaching in the right way. I'm not in the mood, or I want you to try harder. And in that case, I mean, in my experience, like, you want a guy to try more, harder, but you want him to try in a way that's not creepy. I think there's a very subtle difference. And I actually had a conversation with Chris Reynolds on my podcast exactly about that, because, you don't want a man to ask consent all the time. Like, I don't want to be with a guy who's sitting with me in a cinema and saying, can I touch you? Can I put my hand here? You want the guy to take you. That's like, you want him to feel confident enough in his body to make the move without asking me. Like, I don't want, you know what I mean? And so I know that for men, it's a really, like, where is that line of me owning my masculinity, owning my desire to go for it, but not do it in a creepy way. And if she says, this is how my man has, that pursuit, that courtship, that taking no for an answer is actually, to me, and I think to a lot of women, is very attractive. But it's like, where is that line of, okay, this is creepy, or like, don't do that. So do you have an answer for that? And I'm curious. I mean, you must agree with me because you're a woman. You know what I'm talking about. Like, we like a guy who's like, okay, I'm going to take you here. I'm going to take you here. And then, okay, if you give him a clear message a couple of times that, hey, no, I think it's also on the woman to do a hard no. If that's it, where is your boundary? Because in a lot of ways, men don't actually understand or feel. Your no can be just like, no. And then that's a signal for him to come forward, right? So yeah, it's really interesting, the subject.
Yeah, I think when I said no, it's not always a spoken no, right? But if a man approaches me and I'm turning away, or I keep putting my headphones back on, I've had that experience on the train in Manhattan. If I keep putting my headphones back on and he keeps talking to me, he's demanding my attention. I hate that. I'm giving you a signal that I am not available. I want you to listen to my signals. In the same way, at the movie theater, right, the like yawn and putting the arm over, he's testing. He's doing the pursuit. And if she kind of goes like this, if she's saying no with her body, I'm a big proponent of listen. Listen to that. If she's saying yes with her body, then listen to that. Because you're right, it's not necessarily sexy to be verbally asking for consent all along the way. And it's incredibly important to be listening to the signals that you are getting. Because I do think that it can be really hard for women to say no. It can be dangerous for women to say no. There is a reason that we fawn, right? Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fawn is sort of, I'm going to tell you whatever I need to tell you in order to get you to do something. I'm going to maybe flatter you, or, oh, well, maybe next time, or sort of say these things because in some cases it truly isn't safe. And that's important to kind of hold as a truth. And I think a lot of the conversation about embodiment relates to this. Because if a man isn't dropped into his body, he can't feel all of those signals. He's busy thinking about everything, versus if you're in your body and you're, two human beings are two animals, right? Animals don't have to talk about any of this. They're listening with their bodies. They're speaking with they're communicating with their bodies all the time. We can do that too if we're in our bodies. But if we're in our heads, we're missing things. Or I can't tell you how many men I've worked with who are looking back and they're like, oh, I think she was a yes. Of course there are women that were no's, but they're looking back and they're like, man, if I'd been more in my body, I think that was a yes. And I'm like, yeah, I think that was a yes
You
too.
know what
And
that
he was so scared to come across as that guy that he didn't move forward with it. He was like,
yeah.
she was in my dorm room, she stayed a really long time. I'm like, yeah, that was probably a
That
sign.
reminds me, have you studied pickup artists or like have you
Yes.
read the game? Probably, yeah, because
Yes.
so that reminds me, I forget the acronym. So I'm reading the game at the moment and I'm laughing with my husband because he was like a proponent and a researcher of this and like was playing the game and peacocking. But that reminds me of because a lot of the pickup stuff, and for women who don't know, this is like pickup artists community where it's like men teaching other men how to pick up women. But in fact, a lot of this stuff that's being taught is based on social dynamics and exactly what you're talking about, the animalistic responses and the instinctual, unconscious responses. And so all of these guys are teaching other men how to read those signals. And there's what you're talking about. Oh, yeah, that was a yes. That reminded me of a certain technique or an acronym. I think it's called 3 point. They have these really weird, funny
Yeah.
acronyms, but
Yeah.
it was like a three gosh, I got to be three yes rule or something like that. So the rule for guys is like if you see three signals, what you're talking about, there are three yes signals, you can go for a kiss. And so that means that you're talking to her, and let's say you like get up and as you walk, for example, somewhere with like follow me, and you touch her hand, and if she doesn't pull away, that's a yes. Or if you sit down and you kind of you put your hand around her and she doesn't like do this as you described, that's a yes. And you're looking for another yes, and it's a go, and you can kiss her, and it's like it's hilarious how they. But see, the thing is that what you're talking about when men are in their bodies, like I understand that, but I'm also, because masculine energy or alpha energy, at least how I see it and how I've been taught, is like thinking and being in. So that whole kind of logical driving things forward, thinking about it, strategizing, right? That's very alpha. And so it almost not surprises me, but I do understand when you say men are caught up in their heads about what to do with it. But it almost like that you would expect the alpha to calculate his next step. He's already like, I know a lot of times on a date or even in a relationship, you want a man to lead, but when you lead, that means that you know where we're going next. And for you to know when you're going, I mean, yeah, we can argue like you can know, you can feel, and that like you don't need to know your next step as in think about it. You can be here with me and be present. But I'm curious, like meditation, for example, it's a very masculine practice. It's in the head. It's like no thoughts, but it's still here. Like the head is a very masculine place to be. So I'm curious, in your work, how do you bring in, the masculinity, or not the masculinity, the alpha in men, and not involve the head and not involve the strategy of it all?
I think a good example is, say a man is on a date with a woman and he's really interested in what she's saying, but the place where they are, let's say it's a bar, is really loud and he can't really hear her, and he's present enough to notice he wants to hear her. He wants to be able to drop in with her. In that moment, him being present in his body, noticing his desire, is step one. If he's not present in his body, noticing his desire, there is no step two. So let's say that's step one. Step two is, hey, I'm noticing I really want to hear you because what you're saying is important to me. I'd like for us to go on a walk. How do you feel about that? So step two is kind of heady. I mean, not heady exactly, but it's strategizing. It's exactly what you said. It's, this environment is no longer working for our connection. I'm leading us to an environment that is going to work for our connection. Or I'm at least checking in with you. This is where I'd like to lead us. How does that feel for you? She says, great. He leads her out of the bar. So my point is, the man's ability to drop into his body, be in his body, feel his desire. And I don't just mean sexual desire. In that case, maybe there's sexual desire, but it's also desire to know you. I want to know you. I want to hear you. I can't hear you. I want to hear you. Just that desire. If he's not present enough to even do that, if he's not even really listening to what she's saying, because he's like, have I, am I doing it right? Have I made enough jokes? Am I funny enough? Is it working? Is she judging me? Am I being judged by that person over there? You can hear all of those thoughts. He's not in his body, so he's not even going to notice the desire. For me, I have a deep respect for and want to elicit more of masculine intuition, because my experience is that men who are dropped into their bodies are deeply wise. They're deeply wise. They're actually tracking a lot. They're holding a lot. Often they're holding a lot back. But when they're actually in their bodies and they're tracking, one of the things that I've taught men on a date, if they can feel the energy shift, or she's sort of turning away, or he just feels like something has shifted, speak to that. Hey, I noticed something just shifted. I'd love to hear what's going on for you. That's a different resonance, or sorry, that's a different vibration from, is everything okay? Or what most men do, which is they don't ask. They don't ask. They might notice, but they hold back. They lean back. They're not going to ask. And that is partly
Mm-hmm.
because if you're present enough, you're going to notice. You're going to,
Mm-hmm.
especially if someone's pulling away or not having a good time or checked out, like, I'm noticing this. How is this? How does that feel for you?
What's the difference between masculine and feminine intuition?
I don't think there's a lot of difference.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to
So,
me, it's the same thing we're talking about, right? If you're present in your body and you're actually being with the moment, the wisdom that comes to you in that moment is intuition. I just used the word masculine because we were talking about men, but
well, that's why I asked you this question, because you said masculine intuition, and that immediately, you know, I immediately had a thought or question in my mind. So what's the difference? Like, I understand that intuition is intuition, but I still believe that men hold it differently to women, particularly when we talk about polarity, like in that dating situation, right? And I can clearly see how, and that's why all the women are complaining. It's not working. He's not here. Like I think the biggest complaint that we get, and I do it the same. Now that you're talking, I'm thinking about my man. Well, is he really here and present? Is he listening? And I can see how, is he listening, or actually is he feeling? Like, I can see how this technique, I guess, or tool, it's actually a tool, or it's a skill, because I call it, embodiment is a skill. I can see how it can be so helpful to men when they're on a date with a woman, to just be, when he's dropped into his body, he's actually dropped into her body as well. And he can notice easier what is happening in this dynamic, and how can I lead that, and what's
yes,
happening. Like that
yes,
that
yes,
example that you
yes.
said of, I noticed something shifted. So it's not like I think something should. It's that resonance. So this is why for me, polarity and resonance are, it can almost like a different level of polarity, where it's like embodied polarity, right, between an alpha and an omega. But because she's in a feminine essence body, because she wants to be taken and surrendered and relaxed, and he's there to hold that space, right? It's different. Like, that's why when you said masculine intuition, to me, it's different. And as a woman, I can sense, I can have a sense of what it is, but I'm not a man. I'm not I mean, I pretty much know, because I've done a lot of research, and I can also be in that masculine sense, right? But when I'm with a man, it's so attractive and sexy when he's just here, and he's with you. So
Yeah, it's
yes,
hot. It's really
yeah.
hot.
Yeah, and you did write an article that was many, many years ago about 10 things I find sexy in a man, and that aren't all about sex. And you definitely talked
That
about,
aren't all about looks. Yes, that aren't all about looks.
it
Because I
actually
think
says that
that's,
aren't all about sex, but I guess
yeah, the
maybe
original
there's a
title
different.
was
Oh, okay, that
the
aren't all
original
about
title
looks.
was that aren't all about looks, because I
Yeah,
think there's a perception on both sides that I have to look a certain way. I have to be perfect visually to earn or be worthy of love, when actually looks are maybe
yeah,
15 to 20% of it, and 80% of it is what we're talking about here, right?
yeah.
It's
Well,
about the energy flowing through the body. It's not
yeah.
about that physical form.
Yeah,
but
I
we
always
think it
share the
is.
story when my man was a hell no in the beginning, precisely because of the looks and because our first sex was terrible. It was actually the worst sex of my life. And women love that story, and that's such a great example of why, it's not that. It's in the way how he showed up, how he courted me, how he was present and stuff like that. But I think let's just finish off this conversation with this, because when you were talking about this, I was thinking, because women are listening to this, I was thinking, how can women help men become more present, or you know um elicit in them? So I was thinking, is there anything women can do for a guy to be much more present? And I'm curious what you're going to say, but immediately I found my own answer, and is exactly the work that I'm doing. Because if you, as a woman, drop into your body, and this is why, the women I work with, their dating reality is shifting and completely transforming. We're seeing all of these wins and success stories. Oh my god, what kind of dating reality, what kind of men I was dating before, like their world is changing. But it's not because the guys are changing. I mean, men are men, right? As a woman, you're always going to be approached, but it's because she's using all these feminine embodiment tools to drop into her body and to show up on a date with. I always tell them, if dating isn't fun and you burnt out, don't date up until you get to the point where you're excited and you're here. And what a different experience and what a gift to give to a man when you show up on a date open, receptive, right? And just being here and being curious about, I just want to get to know you and I'm here to have fun. And my answer to my own question, I'm curious what you're going to say, is by doing that, you're immediately creating a space, or an invitation for that man to meet you in that place. And not from, like, if you're coming to a date thinking, oh, is he my next husband? Is he doing the checklist? What am I going to say? Da, 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 da. He's going to immediately like tune into you also on that head level. And when you're both in your head, he's talking, but he's thinking one thing and another. It's like not going anywhere. But if you take it, because I'm all about taking radical self responsibility, for me, it's like, I don't even need to know the story. Like when women start talking about their dating, I'm like, stop. Like it's not important. What you need to do right now, let's take radical responsibility. Let's see what this is for you. How does that feel? How can we release that? How can we really own what you're feeling? How can you release that? And then how can you, you know, drop into your own truth and vulnerability and show up on a date with that? And that's why your reality with men is changing, not because this is some magic tricks or whatever. Do you agree with that? Would you say that's the thing? And is there anything else that women can do to help men, be more present, or be on that, embodied masculine? Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you said about that showing up in that open and embodied place. I think that is a great example of Omega polarizing Alpha. That's how Omega polarizes.
Hmm.
That's how you do it when you're in your body and you're in your flow and you're feeling yourself and you've adorned yourself in a way you like and you're showing up open. That generates polarity. That will have a man who has access to that alpha to show up more in that alpha. In the same way that in relationship, it's similar, right? You're showing up with that kind of flow, you're showing up with that kind of embodied essence, you're going to get a different kind of response from your partner. Now, there's only so much either side can do. There's only so much either side can do. I'm just going to stop there. There's only so much either side can do. There's only so much a conscious, embodied, masculine being can open a partner. If she's not ready, she's not ready. And vice versa. There's only so much flow she can embody. If he's not present, he's not present. If his nervous system, if he hasn't developed that capacity to be present,
Hmm.
it's not going to be as effective. I don't know about you, but I've dated multiple men, for example, where they were, addicted to weed or addicted to alcohol, or there was something going on where they were regulating their nervous system because they had so much anxiety and trauma. That's the truth. They were holding so much tension and trauma in their physical bodies that they were kind of constantly medicating, that there was only so much they could be present with me. There was just only so much. They needed to do some work to actually feel safe in their bodies enough to be present. And I think it's the same, for most human beings. A lot of people are going around holding a ton of tension and trauma in their bodies. And some of that needs to be worked and held and released before you're even able to hold lots of pleasure or lots of vulnerability or lots of energy in the system. The system has to be big enough to hold it.
Yeah, 100%. I'm like, we should have booked 3 hours for this interview to have a Joe Rogan style where I want to ask you questions about, sexual trauma and like somatic therapy and like, oh my God, so many things. But I guess, maybe I should do, but I'm like, okay, how do people react when you say, we're going to have a 3 hour interview, Melanie, and like sit here in front of our screens and stuff. But, who knows? Anyways, and we want to talk about sex today because I know you are a sex researcher. And so sex is a really popular topic. But I think we're going to have to do another interview, Melanie. And I know we're probably going to talk on your podcast as well. But yeah, I'd love to have you back where we actually talk about sex because there's so many questions out there that I get from my women. So that's going to be a topic for another conversation. But I'm going to ask you one last question and something that we have started talking about at the beginning of this call, which was, that your journey with this whole work with men and embodiment and sex and all of that and polarity started when you were researching or I guess working on sexual abuse in the Jewish communities, like stopping that. And that led you to the realization that how we stop that is actually by creating healthy, open, and a safe sex culture. So I want to circle back to that and then ask you the question of how do we create this healthy, open, safe, and sex culture, and how does that look like today?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of different answers to that. And I'm going to start with one basic one, which is, for example, we don't have mandatory sex education in our schools, and we are not allowed to talk about pleasure in sex education in the United States, for example. That's an example of the way that puritanical culture is still pervasive all over the place. So, for example, the research shows that if young children know the accurate names of their body parts, like vulva, for example, they're less likely to be molested.
Yeah.
If you know the accurate names of your body parts, you're less likely to be molested. Why? I think it's because parents who are comfortable enough with themselves and their own sexuality and their own body parts are imparting that to their children. Yeah, that's your vulva. You said it was itchy yesterday. How's it doing today?
Is it vulva or vagina? Because I'm telling my daughter vagina.
Vulva is the outside, the labia, the whole. It's mostly you're talking about the vulva, like when you're in the bath and things like that. You're mostly touching your vulva. The vagina is inside.
Oh, so I should be calling it vulva.
Yes.
Okay, good to know. Thanks, Melanie. I have a 3.5-year-old, so I'll be like,
yes,
that's a vulva. The vagina is inside. Okay.
Yes,
yep,
exactly. So I think establishing that healthy, safe sexual culture, it's about parents, it's about teachers, it's about how we educate. It's about, I would like to see relationship education in schools, right? I would like to be talking about relationship dynamics, not just sex, because so much of sex is about relationship. And I don't just mean committed relationship, but for example, they're starting to do more in-depth courses for teenagers. And a lot of it is, my boyfriend wants to have sex. I'm not sure I'm ready. What should I do? It's a sex question, but it's a relational question. It's both. It's and. So we need to be creating lots of space for young people to feel safe, bringing that up with trusted adults, talking it through, maybe even talking it through with peers. But just a safe sexual culture, to me, is one in which it is safe to talk about this. This is a thing we talk about in groups, individually, with trusted people. It's part of our culture instead of this weird, shameful thing that we talk about on the side and learn everything that we know from porn, which is not a safe sexual culture. Mm-hmm. It's also inaccurate. It doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And it's setting ourselves up for failure later on. So I think it takes a lot to get there. I do think we can get there. And I'd really like to see us get there. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, well, it started answering the question, and I know this is a huge subject,
It's a
but
large question, yes.
yeah, but this is a good start, I think. So, Melanie, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, especially when you're working on polarity and doing things, and then you're meeting someone who's like, oh, we didn't know each other and we're doing very similar work and you're working with men, and I'd
Yes,
love to have you back where we can actually talk about sex and unpack that subject and
yes.
sexuality for women and all of that, and for men. So yeah, before you go, just tell us real quick where can women find you? I know you have an amazing podcast where you're also having these girl talks, like the recent ones you did about, you talk a lot about sex, like, if you want a harder cock more of the time. I think this is more for men, but you talked about, what was the other one you shared with me? Oh, does size
Does size
matter? And
matter?
size,
Yeah.
like that, you do girl talks and stuff. So where can women find more about you and your work?
Yeah, my podcast is Dear Men, the Dear Men podcast. And you can find more about me at melaniecurtin.com. I would say that one interesting part of my work is my course, Please Her in Bed, which is all about sex. And I've had couples go through it. I've had men go through it, and I've also had couples go through it. And that's been very bonding because they're able to have conversations maybe they weren't able to have before because they're kind of going through the material together. So if you're in a newer relationship or that's something interesting you want to explore, and that has been of service to people.
Yeah, me and my husband now are kind of looking into different things to, improve. Not that it's bad, but I just want more of it, more of the pleasure, more of the orgasm.
Expand your sex life.
Expand.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. All right. Awesome. Thanks so much, Melanie. It was a pleasure.
Yes.